The sound of a shotgun blast echoed through the dusty streets of Wickenburg, Arizona Territory, as Daisy Fallon clutched her father's lifeless hand. Blood seeped through his vest, his eyes already vacant. The year was 1882, and in a single moment, everything she'd ever known was shattered like the storefront window behind her. "Your pa's debt is settled now," growled Preston Thornton, the tall, broad-shouldered cowboy who stood over them, his Winchester rifle still smoking in his calloused hands. His face remained emotionless beneath the shadow of his black Stetson, his eyes cold as a mountain stream barely registering the life he'd just taken. But the matter of interest remains. Daisy's tears fell onto her father's chest as she looked up at the man who'd haunted her nightmares for months. Preston Thornton owned half the cattle in Yavapai County and commanded respect, or rather fear, from every soul in Wickenburg. Her father had borrowed money from him after drought killed their crops, and now the debt collector had come to claim his due. "I have nothing," she whispered, her voice breaking. At 22, Daisy had never imagined being left alone in the world this way. Her mother had died of fever years ago, and now her father lay dead in the Arizona dust. Preston holstered his weapon and knelt beside her, his shadow falling across her tear-streaked face. "You have yourself," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Your pa offered you as collateral should he fail to pay, a wife for my ranch. The papers are already drawn up with Judge Wilson." Daisy's blood ran cold. "I'd rather die than marry you." A humorless smile crossed his face. "That can be arranged too, Miss Fallon, but I reckon your pa would want you to live." He stood and nodded to his men. "The wedding's tomorrow. You'll be at the church at noon, or I'll burn what's left of your farm to the ground." As Preston Thornton mounted his stallion and rode away, Daisy felt her world collapse around her. The man who just murdered her father would be her husband before the next sunset. The undertaker came for her father's body while townspeople watched from a distance, too afraid of Preston Thornton to offer comfort. Sheriff Davis tipped his hat as he passed, but said nothing. Everyone knew the law in Wickenburg bent to Thornton's will. By nightfall, Daisy sat alone in the small farmhouse that had been her home for 22 years, a single lantern illuminating her father's worn Bible and the wedding dress her mother had left her. Morning came with merciless brightness. Daisy had not slept. Instead, she'd contemplated running, but Thornton's men watched the house all night. She'd considered taking her own life, but her faith wouldn't allow it. Now, she stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror as she buttoned the high-necked ivory dress, her honey-blonde hair falling in waves down her back. "Miss Fallon." A knock at the door startled her. "Time to go." One of Thornton's ranch hands, a weathered man called Jenkins, waited with a wagon. Daisy climbed aboard without assistance, her spine straight and proud despite her circumstances. The church was filled when they arrived, not with well-wishers, but with curious onlookers and Thornton's employees. Preston stood at the altar in a black suit, his dark hair slicked back, revealing a face that might have been handsome if not for the hardness in his jaw and the empty look in his eyes. Daisy walked alone down the aisle, her steps measured and deliberate. No music played. No flowers decorated the pews. This was a business transaction, nothing more. "Dearly beloved," the pastor began, his voice trembling slightly. Daisy barely heard the words as she stood beside her father's killer. When prompted, she spoke her vows in a hollow voice that echoed in the silent church. Preston's responses were firm and possessive. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the pastor concluded, closing his Bible quickly, eager to conclude the macabre ceremony. Preston didn't kiss her. Instead, he took her arm not gently, but not roughly either, and led her outside to where a carriage waited. "My ranch is 15 miles north," he said as they rode out of town. "Your duties will be explained when we arrive." Daisy stared straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge him. "I will never forgive you for what you've done." "I don't require your forgiveness, Mrs. Thornton, only your obedience." The Thornton Ranch sprawled across the valley, a massive main house of timber and stone surrounded by barns, corrals, and bunkhouses. Cowboys stopped their work to watch as the carriage arrived, removing their hats in deference to their boss's new wife. An older Mexican woman met them at the door. "I am Elena," she said, her dark eyes kind as they assessed Daisy. "I run the household. Come, I will show you your room." "Her room is with me," Preston interrupted. Elena's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "As you wish, patron." Preston's bedroom was large and surprisingly well appointed, with a 4-poster bed, oak furniture, and leather-bound books lining one wall. It was the room of a gentleman, not the outlaw she'd imagined. "You'll have your own wardrobe," he said, pointing to a large armoire. "Elena will bring your belongings from your father's place tomorrow." "And what of my father's farm?" Daisy asked, finding her voice. "It's mine now." "Like everything else that belonged to him." His eyes raked over her, making his meaning clear. "I'm not property," she said, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "The law says otherwise." He removed his jacket and hung it precisely on a hook by the door. "I'll be back after supper. Make yourself comfortable." When the door closed behind him, Daisy sank onto the bed, her composure finally breaking. Sobs racked her body as she clutched a pillow to muffle the sound. Her grief for her father mingled with fear and rage at her new husband, the emotions threatening to drown her. Eventually, Elena returned with a tray of food. "You must eat," she said firmly. "Starving yourself won't help." "How can I eat under his roof?" Daisy asked, wiping her tears. "Because you must survive," Elena replied, setting down the tray. "The patron is a hard man, but not always unreasonable." "He killed my father." Elena's face remained impassive. "Many men have died in this territory over money and land. It does not make it right, but it is the way of things." "Not for me," Daisy insisted. "Then change it," Elena said simply. "But you cannot do that if you waste away." Reluctantly, Daisy ate the stew and bread Elena had brought. As darkness fell outside, her dread grew. When the door opened hours later, she sat rigidly in a chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap. Preston entered, smelling of tobacco and whiskey. His eyes found her immediately. "I will not share your bed," Daisy said before he could speak. He regarded her silently for a long moment. "You're my wife, by force, not by choice." Preston removed his gun belt and hung it beside the bed. "I'm not a man who takes unwilling women, Mrs. Thornton. But make no mistake, you are my wife in the eyes of God and the law." "Then where will I sleep?" He gestured to the bed. "You take the left side. I sleep on the right." That night, Daisy lay as far from him as possible, her body tense beneath the quilts. Preston made no move toward her, his breathing eventually deepening into sleep. Only then did she allow herself to cry silently into the pillow. Days passed in this manner. Daisy spent her time learning the household from Elena, who proved to be a patient teacher. The ranch was largely self-sufficient, with vegetable gardens, chickens, a smokehouse, and a dairy barn. Dozens of cowboys worked the vast herds of cattle that grazed Thornton land, and a bunkhouse cook named Hank fed them 3 meals daily. Preston was often gone from dawn until dusk, returning only for the evening meal which they ate in strained silence. At night, they shared the bed without touching, an invisible line drawn down its center. A week into her new life, Daisy was gathering eggs when she heard a commotion in the yard. A group of cowboys had returned from the range, one of them slumped in his saddle, his shirt dark with blood. "Get him to the house." Preston's voice rang out as he dismounted in a fluid motion. Two men carried the injured cowboy, little more than a boy, really into the house and laid him on the kitchen table. Alina rushed to bring water and cloths. "Snake spooked his horse," one of the men explained. "Took a bad fall onto some rocks, bleeding inside, I reckon." Preston's face remained impassive, but his voice softened. "Daniel, can you hear me?" The boy's eyes fluttered open. "Sorry, boss," he whispered. "Nothing to be sorry for," Preston replied, his hand briefly resting on the boy's shoulder. "We'll get you fixed up." But as the minutes passed, it became clear that Daniel's injuries were fatal. His breathing grew labored, and blood seeped from the corner of his mouth. "His mother's in Colorado," one of the men said quietly. "No other family." Preston nodded and remained by Daniel's side, occasionally speaking to him in low tones that Daisy couldn't hear. When the boy finally stilled, Preston reached out and gently closed his eyes. "Wrap him properly," he instructed the men. "We'll bury him tomorrow under the cottonwood by the creek. It has good shade." As the cowboys carried the body out, Preston stood motionless in the kitchen, his face turned away from the others. Daisy, who had watched from the doorway, was startled to see his shoulders tremble slightly before he mastered himself and strode out of the house. That evening, Preston didn't come to dinner. Alina informed Daisy that he was in his study and didn't wish to be disturbed. Against her better judgment, Daisy found herself carrying a tray to the study door. She knocked softly and received a gruff acknowledgement before entering. Preston sat behind a large desk, ledgers open before him, a glass of whiskey at his elbow. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face before the familiar mask returned. "You haven't eaten," Daisy said, setting down the tray. "I'm not hungry. The boy Daniel, you seem to care for him." Preston's jaw tightened. He was a good worker. "It was more than that." Daisy found her courage. "You treated him with kindness, and you find that surprising, that a monster like me could show kindness." His tone was bitter. Daisy met his gaze directly. "Yes." He laughed then, a harsh sound without humor. "At least you're honest, Mrs. Thornton." "Why did you kill my father?" The question burst from her before she could stop it. Preston's eyes darkened. "Your father stole from me. He took money with no intention of repaying it." "That's not true." The drought affected everyone, including me, but I didn't steal to survive it. He was going to pay you back." "With what?" Preston's voice rose. "His farm was worthless. He gambled away what little money he had left. He came to me 3 times for loans, and I gave them because I respected him once. The 3rd time he offered you as collateral." Daisy felt as if she'd been slapped. "You're lying." Preston opened a drawer and removed a folded document, sliding it across the desk to her. "See for yourself." With trembling hands, Daisy unfolded the paper. There, in her father's familiar handwriting, was a contract promising Preston Thornton his daughter's hand in marriage should the debt remain unpaid after 6 months. "I didn't believe he'd do it," Preston continued, his voice quieter now. "When I confronted him that day in town, he drew on me. I reacted." Daisy stared at the contract, her world shifting beneath her feet. "Why marry me then? Why not just take the farm?" "Because a man's word is his bond in this territory. He offered, I accepted. The contract was witnessed and legal. So I'm just a business transaction to you." Daisy's voice was barely audible. Preston drained his whiskey and stared into the empty glass. "We all make our bargains, Mrs. Thornton. Some are just more obvious than others." Daisy left the study, the revelation about her father's actions leaving her confused and adrift. The man she had mourned and defended had essentially sold her to save himself. Yet the man she feared and hated had shown a side today, She hadn't expected a capacity for compassion that didn't fit with the cold-blooded killer she'd believed him to be. The following morning, the entire ranch gathered for Daniel's funeral. Preston spoke briefly but eloquently about the young man's work ethic and character. Afterward, he handed an envelope to one of his foremen. "Send this to his mother in Colorado," he instructed. "It's enough to see her through the winter." Daisy watched from a distance as Preston stood alone by the grave after the others had dispersed. His shoulders were set in a rigid line, his face unreadable beneath his hat. For the first time, she wondered what burdens he carried that she couldn't see. That night, as they prepared for bed in their now familiar routine of careful distance, Daisy broke the silence. "Why did you help Daniel's mother?" Preston paused in unbuttoning his shirt. "What sort of question is that?" "A simple one," he sighed. "Because it was the right thing to do." "Like killing my father was the right thing to do," his jaw tightened. "That was different." "How?" "Because my father wronged you personally. Because your father had choices," Preston snapped. "Daniel was just a boy trying to make his way. He had no choices." "And I did," Daisy challenged. "Did I choose any of this?" Preston's eyes met hers, something complicated passing through them. "No," he admitted finally. "You didn't." It was the closest thing to an apology she expected to receive, and somehow it loosened something tight in her chest. The next day brought a change to their routine when Preston informed her at breakfast that they would be traveling to town for supplies. "I have business at the bank," he explained. "You can visit the mercantile for whatever household items Alina needs." The prospect of leaving the ranch, even briefly, lifted Daisy's spirits. She wore her best dress, one that Alina had altered from her old wardrobe, and pinned her hair carefully. Wickenburg looked different from the vantage point of Preston Thornton's wife. People who had once smiled warmly at Daisy now nodded deferentially or averted their eyes. At the mercantile, the shopkeeper who had known her since childhood addressed her formally as Mrs. Thornton and hovered nervously as she selected fabric and notions. "Please add whatever the lady wants to my account," Preston told the man before leaving for the bank. "I'll return in an hour." Left alone for the first time since her wedding, Daisy was tempted to run. But where would she go? Her father's farm belonged to Preston now. She had no money, no family elsewhere. Wickenburg was the only home she'd ever known, and now she was a stranger here. As she waited for Preston outside the mercantile, a familiar voice called her name. Turning, she saw Mary Wilson, the judge's daughter and her childhood friend, approaching hesitantly. "Daisy," Mary said again, her eyes full of concern. Are you all right?" The simple question nearly broke Daisy's composure. "I'm surviving," she managed. Mary glanced around nervously before whispering. "Everyone's talking about what happened, about your father and the wedding. Father says Mr. Thornton threatened to ruin him if he didn't approve the marriage license." Daisy felt a chill. "Did he tell you what my father did?" "That he offered me as payment for his debts." Mary's eyes widened. "No, that can't be true. I've seen the contract, in his own handwriting." "Oh, Daisy." Mary reached for her hand but stopped as Preston's tall figure appeared down the street walking toward them. "I should go. But if you ever need anything." "Thank you," Daisy whispered as her friend hurried away. Preston nodded to Mary as they passed each other, then turned his attention to Daisy. "Ready to return to the ranch?" "Yes," she said, suddenly eager to leave Wickenburg and its judging eyes behind. On the ride home, Preston was unusually talkative, pointing out improvements he planned for the ranch and asking her opinion on adding fruit trees to the orchard. Daisy answered cautiously, unsure of this new conversational side of her husband. "Why the sudden interest in my thoughts?" she finally asked. Preston kept his eyes on the road. "You're my wife. The ranch will be yours too someday. Your input matters." "I don't understand you," Daisy admitted. "One moment you're the man who killed my father, and the next you're discussing fruit trees as if we're a normal couple." "Life is complicated, Mrs. Thornton. People are rarely all good or all bad." "And which are you?" she challenged. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I'll leave that for you to decide." The weeks that followed brought subtle changes to their relationship. Preston began taking his evening meals with Daisy regularly, their conversations gradually extending beyond the necessities of ranch operation. She learned that he had come to Arizona territory as a boy of 17, working cattle drives before saving enough to buy his first small herd. Now, at 34, he owned one of the largest spreads in the territory. "It wasn't always easy," he admitted one evening as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson. "I've made enemies along the way." "Is that why you're so?" Daisy searched for the word. "Hard," he supplied. "Yes, weakness gets you killed out here." "There's a difference between weakness and kindness," Daisy said softly. Preston was silent for a long moment. "Perhaps." As fall turned toward winter, the nights grew colder. Daisy found herself no longer clinging to the edge of the bed, but gravitating toward the warmth in its center. One morning, she woke to find herself nestled against Preston's side, his arm draped protectively over her. She froze, waiting for him to wake and comment on this development, but he simply rose as usual and began his day. The first real change came during an early December snowstorm. The cattle needed tending, and Preston was short-handed due to illness among the cowboys. Despite Daisy's protests, he rode out into the blizzard to help move the herd to sheltered pastures. Hours passed with no sign of him or the other men. As darkness fell, Alina lit lanterns in every window of the house to guide them home. "The patron knows this land better than anyone," she reassured Daisy, who paced anxiously by the window. "He will return." When hoofbeats finally sounded in the yard near midnight, Daisy rushed outside to find Preston dismounting slowly, his movements stiff with cold. Snow crusted his beard and eyebrows, and his hands were blue when he removed his gloves. "You're half frozen," she scolded, helping him inside. "The men?" Alina asked. "Safe in the line shack on the North Ridge," Preston managed through chattering teeth. "Too dangerous to return tonight." Together, Daisy and Alina got him out of his frozen clothes and into a hot bath. When he was finally warm and dry, Daisy brought him soup and coffee, watching with concern as color gradually returned to his face. "You shouldn't have risked yourself like that," she said, sitting beside him on the bed. "It's my responsibility," he replied simply. "Those men and animals depend on me." Daisy found herself reaching for his hand before she realized what she was doing. His fingers closed around hers, warm now and surprisingly gentle. "Thank you for your concern," he said softly. That night, when Preston fell into an exhausted sleep, Daisy lay watching him in the lamplight. The hard lines of his face were softened in repose, and she found herself wondering about the boy he had been before the territory had shaped him into the man he now was. The shift in their relationship accelerated when Preston fell ill with fever a week later. The doctor from Wickenburg diagnosed pneumonia and prescribed bed rest and medicines that left him weak and disoriented. For 3 days, Daisy barely left his side, spooning broth into his mouth when he was lucid and cooling his brow with damp cloths when the fever raged. During his delirium, Preston spoke of things he never mentioned while conscious: his parents' deaths from cholera when he was 16, the older rancher who had taken him in and taught him the cattle business, the woman who had once promised to marry him, but left with another man when Preston was still struggling to build his empire. "Everyone leaves," he muttered during one feverish night, his hand clutching Daisy's. "Everyone always leaves." "I'm here," she found herself whispering. "I'm not leaving." On the fourth day, his fever broke. When Preston opened his eyes, clear and aware for the first time in days, Daisy was dozing in a chair beside the bed, her hand still in his. "Daisy," he said, his voice hoarse. She started awake. "You're better." "Thanks to you, it seems." His eyes studied her face, noting the dark circles beneath her eyes. "You've been here all this time," Daisy nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "You were very ill." "Why?" he asked, the question hanging between them. "Why care for the man you hate?" She couldn't answer, not fully understanding it herself. Instead, she rose to fetch him water, avoiding his searching gaze. As Preston recovered, something fundamental had changed between them. He began calling her Daisy rather than Mrs. Thornton. She found herself watching for his return at the end of each day. The invisible line down the center of their bed disappeared as they gravitated toward each other in sleep. Yet they existed in a curious limbo, neither acknowledging the shifting dynamics of their relationship. Preston never attempted to claim his husbandly rights, and Daisy never invited him to. Something unspoken held them both in check, perhaps his guilt or her lingering fear. The deadlock broke on Christmas Eve. Preston had been away for 3 days on business in Prescott, the longest they had been apart since their marriage. Daisy had used the time to prepare the house for the holiday, working with Alina to bake pies and cookies, and decorating with pine boughs and red ribbons. When Preston returned late on the afternoon of the 24th, his saddlebags bulging mysteriously, Daisy felt a surge of something that couldn't be anything other than happiness at seeing him. "Welcome home," she said, taking his coat. He studied the decorated house with surprise. "You've been busy." "It's Christmas," she said simply. "I thought we might celebrate." That evening, after a festive dinner with Alina and the senior ranch hands, Preston and Daisy retreated to their bedroom. To her surprise, Preston retrieved a small package from his saddlebag and handed it to her. "I'm not much for gifts," he said gruffly, "but when I saw this in Prescott..." Daisy unwrapped the parcel carefully, revealing a small leather-bound volume of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Inside the cover, Preston had inscribed, "For Daisy may you find beauty even in difficult places." "How did you know I love poetry?" she asked, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I've seen you reading your mother's old books," he admitted. "I thought you might like something new." Daisy had a gift for him as well, a hand-knitted scarf she'd been working on secretly for weeks. "It gets cold on the range," she explained as he ran his fingers over the deep blue wool. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft with an emotion she couldn't name. "No one has made me something by hand since." He trailed off, but she understood. Since his mother, perhaps. They sat before the fire in their room, the usual distance between them somehow reduced to nothing. When Daisy shivered slightly, Preston draped a blanket over both their laps, his arm coming to rest behind her on the settee. "I never thought I'd celebrate Christmas again after my father died," Daisy said, watching the flames dance. "But tonight was lovely." "You've brought something to this house that was missing," Preston said, his eyes on the fire rather than her face. "Something I didn't realize I needed until you were here." Daisy turned to look at him, really look at him. In the firelight, his features were softer, the hardness that usually characterized his expression melted away. His eyes, when they finally met hers, held a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "Preston," she began, not sure what she wanted to say. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I know I'm not the man you would have chosen," he said quietly. "And I can never undo what happened with your father, but I want you to know that he paused, seeming to struggle with the words. I care for you, Daisy, more than I expected to, more than I have a right to." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile as a soap bubble. Daisy searched her heart and found, to her own surprise, that the hatred and fear that had defined her feelings for this man had transformed into something entirely different. "I don't know when it changed," she admitted, "but I no longer see you as the man who took my father's life. I see you as the man who treats his workers fairly, who mourns the loss of a young cowboy who rides out into blizzards to save his herd." She took a deep breath. "The man whose kindness I've come to value." Preston's hand cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "May I kiss you, Daisy? Not as a right, but as something freely given." In answer, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as Preston's arms encircled her, drawing her closer. Daisy felt a warmth bloom within her that had nothing to do with the fire beside them. When they finally parted, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought you'd look at me with anything but hatred," he confessed. "I've lived with that guilt every day." "And I never thought I could feel anything but fear when I looked at you," Daisy replied. "But people change. Feelings change." That night, their relationship transformed. For the first time, they came together as true husband and wife, their lovemaking tender and unhurried. As Daisy lay in Preston's arms afterward, she marveled at the journey that had brought them here, from hatred to understanding, from fear to affection, and perhaps, though neither had said the word aloud, to love. The new year brought changes to the Thornton ranch. Preston consulted Daisy on decisions both large and small, from which bulls to purchase for breeding to where to plant the apple orchard she'd suggested. The cowboys, who had once been wary of their boss's forced bride, now tipped their hats respectfully when she visited the barns or brought lunch to the men working the corrals. In February, when Preston announced his intention to travel to Denver on business, he asked Daisy to accompany him. "I'll be meeting with potential investors for the railroad spur I want to bring to Wickenburg," he explained. "Having my wife with me will make a good impression." The journey was Daisy's first beyond the confines of Yavapai County. Denver's grandeur overwhelmed her: the elegant hotels, the theaters, the shops filled with luxuries she'd only read about in magazines. Preston bought her new dresses and took her to see a Shakespeare play performed by a traveling company from New York. "You don't have to spend so much on me," she protested after he purchased a silver hair comb adorned with tiny sapphires. "I want to," he replied simply. "I have the means, and it gives me pleasure to see you happy." The business meetings went well, with the investors impressed by Preston's detailed knowledge of the territory and his vision for expanding commerce in the area. Several of the men brought their wives to dinner one evening, and Daisy found herself engaged in conversations about everything from Eastern fashions to women's suffrage. "You were magnificent," Preston told her later in their hotel room. "Those Boston ladies didn't know what to make of a woman who could discuss cattle prices and poetry in the same breath." Daisy laughed. "I was terrified they'd see through me, just a farmer's daughter playing at being a wealthy rancher's wife." Preston pulled her into his arms. "You are a wealthy rancher's wife, and you're exactly who you should be: intelligent, compassionate, and strong enough to have survived everything life has thrown at you." On their last night in Denver, Preston took her to the finest restaurant in the city. After they had finished their meal, he reached across the table and took her hand. "There's something I need to say," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "When we married, it wasn't by your choice or for the right reasons. I've regretted many things in my life, Daisy, but I can't regret that you became my wife, even knowing how it came about." Daisy squeezed his hand, encouraging him to continue. "What I'm trying to say is that I love you," he said finally, the words emerging rough and sincere. "I know I have no right to ask for your love in return, given our beginning, but I love you too," Daisy interrupted, surprising herself with the certainty of the words. "Not despite our beginning, but because of who you've shown yourself to be since then." Preston's face transformed with a smile unlike any she'd seen before, open and joyful, and without reservation. Later that night, he made love to her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes, whispering her name like a prayer. When they returned to the ranch, they brought with them not only the railroad investment contracts, but a new understanding between them. The past could not be erased. Preston had still taken her father's life, and Daisy had still been forced into marriage, but they had forged something new and genuine from those broken beginnings. Spring came to Arizona territory in a riot of wildflowers and the bawling of newborn calves. The railroad investors visited the ranch, impressed by Preston's operation and the detailed plans he presented for the spur line that would connect Wickenburg to the main tracks, opening new markets for the region's cattle and mineral wealth. "Your husband is quite the visionary," one of the Boston investors told Daisy during a tour of the ranch. "He sees possibilities others miss." "That's true in many ways," Daisy agreed, watching Preston demonstrate the new windmill he'd installed to bring water to the eastern pastures. In May, Daisy confirmed what she had suspected for weeks: she was expecting their first child. When she told Preston, he lifted her off her feet in an uncharacteristic display of emotion, spinning her around before setting her down carefully. "A baby," he said wonderingly, his hand coming to rest on her still flat stomach. "Our child." The joy in his eyes banished the last shadows between them. This child would be born of love, not obligation, and would never know the circumstances that had first brought its parents together. As Daisy's pregnancy progressed, Preston became increasingly protective, insisting she rest during the heat of the day and bringing her wild strawberries he found on his rides around the property. The entire ranch seemed to hover around her, from Alina's special herbal teas to the Cowboy's awkward, but sincere offers to fetch anything she might need. "You'd think I was the first woman to ever have a baby," Daisy laughed to Preston one evening as they sat on the porch watching a summer thunderstorm roll across the valley. "You're the first Mrs. Thornton to carry the next generation of this ranch," he replied, his hand covering hers where it rested on her rounded belly. "That makes it special." In late November, as the first winter chills settled over Wickenburg, Daisy gave birth to a son they named William James Thornton. The labor was difficult, lasting nearly 2 days, with the doctor from town eventually called to assist. Throughout it all, Preston refused to leave her side, his face etched with worry as he held her hand through each contraction. When William finally arrived, squalling and red-faced, Preston held him with hands that trembled slightly. "He's perfect," he whispered, looking from the tiny face to Daisy's exhausted smile. "Like his mother." The baby thrived, growing stronger each day. He had Preston's dark hair, and Daisy's clear blue eyes, a physical manifestation of their union. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other, they baptized him in the Wickenburg church, the same building where they had exchanged their vows 18 months earlier. The town's attitude toward the Thorntons had gradually shifted as Preston's railroad project brought new prosperity to the area. People who had once crossed the street to avoid him now greeted the family warmly, admiring baby William and congratulating Preston on the railroad's progress. After the baptism, Mary Wilson, now married herself, approached Daisy hesitantly. "Your son is beautiful," she said, smiling at the infant in Daisy's arms. You look happy, truly happy." "I am," Daisy confirmed, glancing at Preston, who stood nearby speaking with the pastor. "It wasn't the beginning I would have chosen, but the journey has led somewhere unexpected and wonderful." "I'm glad," Mary said sincerely. "We've all heard how the ranch has flourished under both your guidance. They say Preston Thornton is a changed man since you came into his life." Daisy shook her head slightly. "Not changed exactly, just more fully himself than he allowed before." That evening, as they put William to bed in the cradle Preston had carved by hand during the final months of Daisy's pregnancy, Preston drew her into the circle of his arms. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed quietly. "A family, a wife who sees me, really sees me, a son." His voice caught on the last word. "Neither did I," Daisy replied, leaning into his strength. "Not after that day in town when everything changed." Preston's arms tightened around her. "I wish I could undo the way it happened. I know." She turned in his embrace to face him. "But then we might never have found each other. Life has strange paths, Preston. Ours was harder than most at the beginning, but look where it's led us." He kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and gratitude and love that had grown from the most unlikely soil. 5 years passed, bringing both challenges and joys to the Thornton family. The railroad spur was completed, transforming Wickenburg into a bustling hub of commerce. The Thornton Ranch expanded, with new lands purchased and innovative breeding programs that produced hardier cattle better suited to the Arizona climate. William grew into a sturdy, curious boy who shadowed Preston around the ranch and helped Daisy in the kitchen garden she had established. When he was 3, he gained a sister, Elizabeth Elena, named for both Daisy's favorite poet and the woman who had become like a grandmother to William. On a warm spring evening in 1889, Daisy sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching Preston teach William to throw a lariat. Elizabeth played at her feet, arranging pebbles in careful patterns on the wooden boards. The scene before her, her husband's patient instruction, her son's determined concentration, her daughter's creative focus filled Daisy with a contentment she had once thought impossible. Preston looked up, catching her gaze across the yard. The smile that crossed his face was meant only for her, open and warm in a way few people ever saw from the formidable rancher. He said something to William, tousled the boy's dark hair, and walked toward the porch. "You looked lost in thought," he said, sitting beside her and lifting Elizabeth onto his lap. "I was thinking about beginnings and endings," Daisy replied, "and how sometimes what seems like an ending can be the beginning of something you never imagined." Preston took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "7 years ago, I thought I was claiming a debt. Instead, I found everything I never knew I was looking for. And I thought I was sentenced to a lifetime with a monster," Daisy said softly. "Instead, I discovered the kindest heart behind the quietest eyes." "Papa, watch," William called from the yard, swinging his small lariat with determined concentration. As Preston turned to applaud their son's efforts, Daisy studied his profile. The strong jaw now softened when he smiled. The eyes that had once seemed cold but now warmed whenever they rested on her or their children. The journey from fear to love had not been easy or straight, but as she watched her family in the golden light of sunset, Daisy knew she wouldn't change a single step that had brought them here. That night, with the children asleep and the ranch quiet around them, Preston and Daisy stood together at their bedroom window, looking out at the vast Arizona sky filled with stars. "You ever regret it?" Preston asked suddenly. "Staying with me after everything?" Daisy turned to him, framing his face with her hands. "No," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment." She kissed him softly, pouring 7 years of growing love into the gesture. Our beginning was written in grief and fear, but our story belongs to us now. And I choose to write it with you, every day. As Preston gathered her in his arms, Daisy closed her eyes and gave thanks for the unexpected path that had led her here to this man, this family, this love that had been forged in the harshest circumstances, but had emerged stronger for the tempering. The sound of the ranch awakening filtered through their window at dawn, cowboys calling to one another, horses nickering in the corrals, chickens announcing the new day. Soon, their children would burst into the room, eager to begin another day of adventures. But for now, in the quiet moments before the world fully stirred, Daisy lay in Preston's arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "More today than yesterday. And I love you," she replied. "More than I once thought possible." It was enough, more than enough. It was everything.